Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
Could you imagine them in a split second? You know when you hear people say that as they're facing death, their life flashes before them in a split second. You could imagine in a split second Abraham thinking, God, what are you asking me? Why would you do this? There's got to be another answer.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
From start to finish, the Bible reveals God's desire to have a close relationship with his human creations. But there's one relationship in the Bible which is especially close, and it's the relationship between God and Abraham. So close, in fact, that God actually called him his friend.
Yeah, we've discussed in previous programs, particularly the subject of being a bondslave to Christ and realising that we are slaves to Christ. We're bought, we're paid for, we don't belong to ourselves anymore, we belong to him. But then you kind of think it's a little bit conflicting because there are other places that we're joined ears with Jesus or that we're now called the friend of God. Mm-hmm. Jesus said that to his disciples. And then, of course, there's the example, as you said, of Abraham. So what is it? Well, remember that just like the different names of God reflect that he has very different facets all the time, but he's all of those things at the same time, all of those different characteristics. He's not just one and then another, he's all of those things. So we as well, we are bond slaves to Christ, we are his children, we are adopted into his family, we are joint heirs with Jesus, and we are the friend of God. We are all of those things, and in various different aspects of our lives, those particular roles or relationship facets that we have come into play. So Abraham, called the friend of God, and it's actually, if you think about it, if you've got the God of all creation and there is a human being, a fallen human being, he says, I'm your friend or you're my friend. It's quite remarkable. Yeah. And so if you look at this particular relationship, it all sort of points to a particular event that took place in a relationship between God and Abraham. Okay, so if you look at the plans that God had for humanity, God already knew what it was going to take, and he called Abraham, and he led him to a particular point. It was almost like the pinnacle of the relationship between Abraham and God, and that particular event took place on Mount Moriah. That particular event started a ripple effect that has not ceased. It has literally travelled throughout the millennia of human history, has reverberated around the world, and it will continue until God's purpose and plan for humanity, which is his plan of redemption, is fulfilled and completed. And then, throughout eternity, we're going to be celebrating that particular event. Of course, I'm talking about when God called Abraham to take his son, Isaac, and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. Now, that is from the story in Genesis chapter 2. We've talked about it before. And if you you can't actually see it particularly in the English translations of the Bible, but in the Hebrew, it's not a command. God doesn't command Abraham. Like he doesn't say to him, Abraham, and that's when he calls out and he says, Hineni, or here I am, which I might add actually means unconditional availability. So that's what, when you see the here I am or behold, here I am, he's saying unconditional availability. We'd all like to put our hands up and say, yes, God, unconditional availability on my part, but most of us would say, what's the conditions first? We want to know what the instructions are. Okay, so if Abraham says, here I am, and God says, it's almost like a request. He doesn't say, will you? He says, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. You can hear this emotion in this particular passage because at the moment this is pivotal for the Abrahamic covenant. We're talking covenant language here. And he's pouring this emotion and he says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and take him to a place, the mountain that I'm going to tell you, and there you're going to offer him to me. Now, that is actually, as a parent, and you would feel this as well, you can't really get your head around that. You say, no, that cannot possibly be the voice of God because God would not ask me to do that. Yeah. That's just too hard to try to comprehend. But anyway, he goes, Abraham sorts out the wood, and he goes with his son. They have servants, but they get to the point where they leave the servants behind and they go up the mountain together. And of course, Isaac says to him, well, we've got the wood for the fire, but where's the offering, Dad?
Yeah.
And that's when Abraham says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Genesis 22:8. Now, there are a lot of scholars who believe that Abraham, after having years of developing this relationship with God to this point, believed that he was acting out prophecy because God had already promised a lineage through Isaac.
Yeah, that's right.
But at the same time, how is this going to happen if I've got to kill my son? He understood the language of covenant even if he didn't understand exactly why it was happening this way.
So I guess Abraham either believed that God would provide an alternate sacrifice or that he would literally raise Isaac from the dead.
Yeah, it had to be one or the other. It had to be. But could you imagine what it would have been like for Abraham to raise the knife above his bound son, looking into his eyes, knowing what he was about to do?
Yeah.
So the question, could you imagine them in a split second? You know when you hear people say that as they're facing death, their life flashes before them in a split second. You could imagine in a split second Abraham thinking, God, what are you asking me? Why would you do this? There's got to be another answer. You could just imagine it.
Yeah.
And the pain that he would have been feeling, the trauma, the anxiety, the stress, the heartache, all of that.
Yeah.
And of course, God says, no, stop, don't. Now you ask yourself, didn't God know that Abraham would follow through? Didn't he know that Abraham would be obedient? Yes, of course he did. That is because God is God. But Abraham didn't know until the split second that he was going to follow through. And you wonder, was he into child sacrifice? We've discussed this before. Absolutely not. Actually, Genesis 22:1 tells us why God did this. It says because he was testing Abraham. This was so that Abraham would know that he really, really, really 100% trusted God and his word. So here's where this friendship comes in. Because Abraham understood ancient covenants, if one person fulfills a portion of a covenant, the other person has the same obligation. So if Abraham did not withhold his only son as part of this covenant, now God was obligated to not withhold his son as part of the covenant. And at that point, both understood the kind of anguish and pain and excruciating agony that the other felt at sacrificing their son. And of course, it's on that very, very spot on Mount Moriah where essentially Abraham offered Isaac, is that God offered his son, Jesus Christ, Yeshua, the Messiah, on the same spot, fulfilling and meeting the criteria of the Abrahamic covenant. You gave me your son, I'm going to give you my son, and that son is going to be for all the generations that come after you and those who are adopted in. And so that is why Abraham, quite honestly, could easily be called the friend of God, because they'd made this covenant and not withheld the greatest and most important and most sacred thing that they had from each other. They were friends.
Yeah. And I guess that's because in friendship there's an intimacy, that's intimacy because there's transparency. And as you say, when Abraham says, I know how God feels, God says, I know how Abraham feels. So there is that transparency that is in that relationship.
Don't you find that astounding that God could have such a close relationship with a fallen human being that they could actually look at each other and say, I know what you're going through. Yeah. And they really did know what the other was going through, and therefore they're now friends. And it might possibly be what Paul was even referring to in Philippians 3:10-11. He said, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, in order that I may attain the resurrection of the dead. You know, we often like to think, at times leading up to Easter during Lent, that if I give up coffee or chocolate, that I'm participating in the sufferings of Christ. Yeah. That really is not what that's about. Right. Abraham knew what it meant to participate in God's sufferings. Yeah. But when you respond to God and say, Hineni, like Abraham did, I am committing to unconditional obedience to whatever it is you're calling me to, even if it means participating in the sufferings similar to what you've done, we are also called a friends of God.
It's a great study, and as always, there's more in the notes. You can read them online at vision.org.au/foundations. Well, we did look at the word Hineni briefly in this program, and next time we're going to unpack it some more to find out why this small Hebrew word has such big meaning.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.